Four friends, one deception, and a silence that turned deadly. Welcome to Phantom Mystery. I am your host, Edmund Cross. Drop a comment below. Where are you watching from tonight? Your words make these mysteries come alive. It was the sort of afternoon that seemed designed for a garden party. The lawns at Little Ashford gleamed emerald green, dotted with canvas chairs and shaded by the careful placement of striped parasols. The rose beds were in their final flush of July bloom, and the air hummed with the contented drone of bees, moving languidly from bloom to bloom as if they too were guests at the vicar's annual fete. Mrs. Weatherby, stout and florid, presided over the tea cakes with the air of a reigning monarch, while her husband poured weak lemonade for the village children. There were cakes, seed, sponge, and fruit, and more gossip than sandwiches. For in Little Ashford, gossip was nourishment, and the fate supplied it in generous portions. Miss Marple, sitting quietly in the shade of a laburnum tree, was not the sort of figure to draw attention. A sprightly lady in her late 70s, knitting needles resting in her lap, she seemed more absorbed in a half-finished cardigan than in the conversations flitting about her. But her pale blue eyes, sharp behind their spectacles, noted everything. The way Mrs. Templeton refilled her glass of sherry with unusual haste, the stiffness in young Tom Bartlett's handshake, the peculiar absence of the usually punctual Dr. Latham. The fate was in full swing when the first scream cut through the air. It was high-pitched, sudden, and utterly unbefitting the cheerful chatter of a summer afternoon. All heads turned toward the croquet lawn where a small crowd had begun to gather. There, stretched out on the grass beside the mallet stand, lay the body of Mr. Leonard Price. His face was ashen, his eyes wide open in an expression of startled disbelief. The croquet balls absurdly were scattered about him like children's toys. "He's dead!" cried Mrs. Templeton, clutching her pearls with unnecessary drama. The vicar, flustered and sweating, stumbled forward, while several of the younger men rushed to lift the body. Yet it was clear from the first glance that Mr. Price had no more life in him than the mallets at his side. Miss Marple did not stir from her seat. Her needles clicked softly once more as the babble of speculation began. People hurried forward with anxious faces, offering opinions, condolences, and theories in equal measure. But Miss Marple's calm eyes lingered instead on a few unnoticed details. A fragment of lace snagged upon the hedge nearby, a half-empty glass of lemonade set neatly upon the croquet bench, and the peculiar expression, half relief, half horror, that flitted across Mrs. Weatherby's face before she composed herself. The fete was over, though no one had declared it. And in Little Ashford, where everyone knew everyone, the shocking truth was already dawning. Someone here had wanted Mr. Leonard Price very much dead. The croquet balls had not rolled far, yet their scatter sent Little Ashford spinning. People divided into eddies toward the tea table, the vicarage porch, the wicket gate. Voices braided, unbraided, and braided again, gasps turning into whispers, whispers into confidences. Miss Marple rose when the first flurry settled. She folded her knitting with neat economy and walked to the edge of the croquet lawn. Her shawl from the tombola, pink of a pattern she deplored, had been spread over Mr. Leonard Price. Mrs. Weatherby dabbed at her eyes while positioning herself to answer questions. "Keep back, if you please," the vicar urged, and then, gratefully, "Tom, the call box." Tom Bartlett ran at once. He returned in short order, flushed and breathless. Constable Sykes was on his bicycle. Inspector Hale would drive from Little Morton. "It is," Mrs. Templeton breathed. He looked, struck by something dreadful. Miss Marple had already noticed the half-empty lemonade glass on the bench, and snagged low on the hedge a shred of white lace. Not veil lace, too sturdy. Beyond the hedge, a wicket gate led to the meadow path and thence to the lane behind the ironmonger's, convenient for anyone wishing not to be seen. Constable Sykes arrived, stout with purpose, and began to collect names. Inspector Hale followed, lean, tidy, a careful smile that asked more than it promised. He surveyed lawn, shawl, scattered balls, and the measured ring of villagers then bent to his task. "Anyone handle this?" he asked, indicating the glass. "No one," Mrs. Weatherby said too quickly. He poured it himself. Alice brought the fresh jug. Alice, pink-cheeked and earnest, nodded. Auntie said how much essence to add. "Essence?" Hale's pencil paused. "Lemon essence," Mrs. Weatherby said, grief offended. "For flavour." "I keep it for fates. Lemon masked many sins." Miss Marple remembered a gardener who had used a bottle for slugs and for quarrels. She did not say so. Gossip began its duty. Mr. Price, it seemed, had spent months collecting for the village hall roof. He kept lists, he urged. He threatened to pin arrears on the notice board. Mrs. Price, small, composed, the look of one who tidies even sorrow, arrived on Mrs. Latham's arm. "Leonard did not take lemonade," she said steadily. "It troubles his digestion. He prefers weak tea." "He drank," Mrs. Weatherby insisted, then faltered. "At least he carried the glass." Inspector Hale listened without hurry. Dr. Latham, unfortunately, was away at a confinement. "We'll need him soon," Hale told Sykes, and took the glass into his keeping. Miss Pratt, who never noticed anything beyond sponge cake tides, remembered Mr. Price speaking sharply to Tom Bartlett by the skittles. Mr. Dilly, the ironmonger, recalled a dispute over allotments. Mrs. Templeton hinted at female difficulties and was almost certainly wrong. Miss Marple let the gust of surmise pass over her. Those at the centre performed, those at the edges revealed. Tom's wholesome stolidity had acquired a crack. A smear of green clung to one knee, fresh cut grass. Alice, when addressed, counted on her fingers, a nervous habit. Mrs. Weatherby's first shocked relief is a shy animal, had not returned. Inspector Hale, who had once met Miss Marple over a bicycle lamp that illuminated more than it ought, came politely. "You were seated there, ma'am?" "In the shade." "One does not flaunt complexion. Did Mr. Price quarrel near you?" "I should not call it a quarrel. He was earnest with Tom. Tom was monosyllabic, which is safe for him. Mr. Price looked warm and rather pleased. Pleased. Like a man who has remembered something useful," she said. "There is a pride that pats its pockets." Hale's mouth twitched. He sent Sykes for the essence bottle and the jug. As the shawled figure was lifted and taken within, sympathy separated into curiosity, relief, fear, and kindness. The vicar prayed. During the murmurs, Miss Marple watched hands, who clenched, who fiddled, who lay flat. Alice's fingers ticked. Mrs. Templeton smoothed her collar and winced when it caught. Tom held himself too still. Presently Hale released people in order, addresses recorded, assurances offered. The feet, like a toy wound too hard, unwound in careful clicks. Bunting sagged. Children were steered away with warnings to hush. They obeyed noisily. Mrs. Latham promised soup. Mr. Dilly muttered about locks. Miss Pratt asked whether the fete could be resumed on Monday, which nobody answered. Even grief must eat, and practical souls said about it. The bees kept working in the roses, indifferent. Miss Marple strolled to the wicket gate. She did not touch the lace. She examined the latch. Within the crevice, where a frequently used latch grows polished, lay a fine bloom of dust. A clean swipe marred it, recent. The path led round the vicarage to the surgery lane, secluded enough for a brief disappearance. She turned back as Inspector Hale approached, with the essence bottle pinched between finger and thumb. "Essence found," he said. "Also an odour not wholly lemon." "One hears of such things," Miss Marple replied gravely. "Yet one also hears of troubled digestions. People remain what they have always been. Only the names of their conveniences change." Mrs. Price, seated in the cool of the drawing-room, asked whether Leonard would be brought home. "Not yet," Hale said gently. "We must be certain." She nodded. No tears came. Outside, Tom Bartlett hovered, drawn and repelled by the scene. "Inspector, if you've done with me, I could fetch the doctor on my bicycle. Constable has the motor car. Remain available." Tom coloured, the wholesome mask slipping and recovering. He muttered about hedge clippings. Miss Marple's eye followed the hedge's line to the snag of lace. Hedge clippings and lace were poor companions. As people drifted homeward in twos and threes, talk sharpened into the shapes to be repeated over supper. Mr. Price had enemies. Mr. Price had threatened exposure. He had powders for his stomach. He had insured his life last month. He had a will no one had seen. Their stories sprouted feet and tail. Miss Marple lingered until bunting was loosened and trestles folded. Passing the croquet stand, she paused. One mallet lay apart, its handle faintly tacky. She did not touch. The police had their work, and she had hers, which was to remember and compare. The afternoon that had begun in trifles had put on, like morning, an uncomfortable dignity. Miss Marple, taking the longer footpath home, considered the liberty murder takes with pretense. Stripped of illusion, people become briefly legible. She had read a word or two. The sentence would require patience. At her gate she dead-headed a rose with a small, ruthless pinch. "Poor Mr. Price," she said, and after a moment, "Poor little Ashford." By bedtime every house would set a table with a theory. Only one, she feared, would prove nourishing. She put on the kettle and set cup to saucer with her habitual care. Then she sat not to knit, but to think of lace, lemon, a gate's dusty bloom, and a man who patted his pockets because he had remembered something useful. When the knock came, light, apologetic, she knew Inspector Hale would be on the step, wanting not advice but something more modest, the kind of listening that asks the right silence. The knock, as she had predicted, was Hale's, 2 brisk taps and a pause, as if he were arranging his thoughts before he entered. Miss Marple opened at once. Dusk had drawn up from the hedges. She set an extra cup on the tray, sugar handy, milk at the ready. "I have come for plain sense," Hale said, removing his hat. "One pours what one has," she said. "Lemon?" "Not tonight." He half smiled and took the chair by the small fire. He told her what was certain and what guessed. The glass and essence bottle was sealed away. A constable's nose thought the bottle carried more than lemons. Dr. Latham had been sent for, and would attend presently. Mrs. Price made no scene. The village, after its shock, had set about its usual comfort, explaining everything and nothing. "I'm overstocked with suspects," Hale said. "Like a jar of boiled sweets. Too many colours, none inviting." "That is because the true flavour is dull," Miss Marple returned. Hale's eyes flicked. "Do you notice the lace on the wicket hedge? It is the narrow, strong sort on house aprons. Alice Weatherby wears such. She fusses with hedges when flurried. Does the wicket matter?" "Anything that permits brief vanishing matters very much," she said. Hale nodded. Mr. Price's pockets contained an unsealed envelope addressed to himself. Empty. Then he had found something to put in it, and someone found it first. She poured more tea. "Do you know who owed and who paid?" "Mrs. Weatherby promptly. Mr. Dilly grudgingly. Mrs. Templeton twice and told it thrice. Tom Bartlett not yet, he promised today." "The village behaves as villages do," Miss Marple said. "Who feared a list nailed to the notice board?" "More than one," he admitted. They walked to the vicarage together. The hedges looked thick and honest in the half-light. Hale lifted the latch with his pencil. The clean swipe across the dusty polish showed. He grunted, satisfied. She did not contradict within. Mrs. Weatherby, efficient despite distress, produced a stout ledger, cakes, lemonade, sherries, set down in a firm hand. "You see, I was everywhere," she said, half laughing, half offended. "I could not be wicked if I tried." "Being everywhere is useful," Miss Marple murmured. "One sees who is nowhere." Hale examined the ledger because it is proper to examine ledgers. Alice stood by the door, fingers counting things no one else could see. "My dear," Miss Marple asked gently, "did the roses fetch a good price?" "Oh, yes, ma'am. Mrs. Templeton bought 3. Alice swallowed. "Mr. Price took a lemonade but left it. He said he preferred tea. He forgot it on the bench when he went to Tom." "Forgot," Miss Marple repeated. Mrs. Weatherby turned sharply. Alice often mistakes things. Less often than one supposes, Miss Marple said. In the croquet corner, one mallet lay a little apart. Hale did not touch it. Constable Sykes watched the room where the body lay. They found Mrs. Price at a neighbour's, persuaded not to be alone. She had put her hands to small orderings. She spoke without embroidery. Leonard had risen early, called at the ironmonger's, been cheerful. He had slipped an envelope into his pocket and said with satisfaction, "Now we shall see." What was meant by that? Hale asked. He did not tell me, she said, and the habit of being told nothing lay in the room like a folded shawl. Was he lenient with people? Miss Marple asked. He was thorough, Mrs. Price said at last. He thought it improved people to be exact. He told Tom Bartlett he would put his name at the top where all would see. That was unkind, Miss Marple said. When they left, Hale said, "He pricked vanities." "Can someone pricked first?" "Vanities are tenderer than reputations," Miss Marple answered. They parted for an hour, Hale to his station, Miss Marple to her cottage, agreeing he would send word when the doctor returned. She lit her lamp and took up her knitting, but the pattern wandered. She thought instead of Alice and the hedge, of Tom's grass-stained knee, of Mrs. Weatherby's mastery, and of the small civil cruelties that pass as zeal. Forgot was a useful word. People remember what hurts them. They forget what is convenient to another. Mr. Price, pleased with his envelope, had not forgotten it. He had been induced to set something down. Near 10, Dr. Latham knocked, tired, grave. Inspector Hale said you would be awake. He apologized and refused tea. "I will not speak to poison until Hale has what he needs," he said. "But the signs suggest a swift agent." Bitterness on the tongue. He swallowed very little. If it was in the lemonade, he scarcely took it. "Or tasted and set it down," Miss Marple said. Latham rubbed his brow. "I saw tackiness on a mallet handle. Varnish not quite dry or some adhesive. Why was a newly dead man found by it?" "Because someone wished death to look accidental among toys," she said. "Or else someone handled the mallet who would rather not have it noticed. Tom?" Latham asked, then flushed. "Forgive me. He is decent." "Decency is an excellent alibi," Miss Marple said. "Fortunately, it seldom suffices." He hesitated, then rose. "Hale will call early." After he had gone, she set cups in a tidy row and let the lane's small sounds come to her. Steps hurried past, returned, paused. A soft scratch at the gate, young, apologetic. Miss Marple opened before the knock. Alice stood there without a shawl, fingers twisting as though counting warmth she did not possess. "I shouldn't be out," she whispered. "Aunt will be furious. But I had to tell you. It's the lace. I catch it on everything. On that hedge, too. Only I didn't go through the wicket when Mr. Price fell. I went the long way for more cups." "That is a long way for cups," Miss Marple said. "Aunt said not to fuss the ladies by the hedge. She told me to use the back steps. And Tom came by the hedge a minute before. He was wiping his hand on his trousers. He looked as if he'd seen a ghost. He said he'd meet me at the pump if I kept quiet about it." "About what?" "I don't know," she wailed softly. "Only he said he hadn't touched the glass. He said it twice, as if I'd asked. But I hadn't." She swallowed. "I don't want to say wrong of him." "He's always been decent," Miss Marple supplied. Alice nodded miserably and fled the short way back. Miss Marple stood a moment in the quiet. Inexperience is clumsy, guilt tidy, fear a bad housekeeper. Tonight had given her 3 small articles: a word, forgot; a habit, counting; a promise, I hadn't touched the glass. A 4th glimmered, faint as a pinhead, there for anyone willing to prefer dull colours to bright. Morning would bring Hale and the village with flowers for a widow. Custom is useful. People who visit to be kind arrive at a reasonable hour, and the truly anxious do not come empty-handed. Miss Marple, who believed in such timings, set her kettle and laid out her plainest hat for calls tomorrow. Dawn came pale. Miss Marple woke early, set the kettle on, and fetched her paper while the village put on propriety. blinds drawn, voices lowered, doorsteps scrubbed too fiercely. Mr. Dilly swept his threshold and muttered that a man who publishes ledgers invites trouble. She agreed politely, and kept her thoughts where she had put them overnight. Inspector Hale arrived at 9, refused toast, accepted tea, and set his facts down. The doctor reported a swift alkaloid. Bitterness marked the tongue. Traces sat on the lemonade glass, most of all on the rim. The jug was clean. The lemon essence carried a ghost of wrongness, plausible, insufficient. The croquet mallet was tacky with resin. There were scuffs on the hedge path, and a smear on the wicket latch. Bartlett admits a quarrel, Hale concluded. He denies touching the glass. Denials rehearsed are not always false, Miss Marple said. There is also a pantry deficiency, he added. A tin of rat poison missing. Mrs. Price supposes her husband lent it to Dilly. Suppositions are rafts launched when the bank is muddy, she murmured. Let us walk. They went to the vicarage lawn where chairs still waited in a baffled semicircle. Mrs. Weatherby, red-eyed and efficient, had already begun a subscription for the widow. She indicated tea here, lemonade there, and said that Mr. Price took a glass and then left it on the croquet bench when zeal or vanity sent him to speak to Tom. Nearly I scolded him, she confessed. But one cannot at a fete. Nearly is a useful adverb, Miss Marple said. At the bench a pale ring showed where a glass had rested. Miss Marple noticed small bruises in the lawn and the hedge, where a snag of narrow, stout lace fluttered. Alice came out with rinsed tumblers. When asked whether anyone touched the bench, her fingers began their counting. Mrs. Templeton set her compact there, she said. She nudged the glass a little. Alice embroiders, Mrs. Weatherby said. Embroidery can be accurate, Miss Marple said. They found Mrs. Templeton among geraniums. Yes, I set it down, she admitted at once. The glass annoyed me. I moved it a trifle. Did anyone remark upon the lemonade? Hale asked. Mrs. Weatherby did, Mrs. Templeton said. She said the essence smelt queer, but waste was worse, and to add the fresh jug. On the lane they met Tom Bartlett, hat in hand. Before Hale could ask, he blurted that glue from the mallet had stuck to his palm, that he had taken the back path out of foolishness, that he had not touched the glass. You have said that twice before you were invited once, Miss Marple told him. I've nothing but my name, he said. If Mr. Price meant to nail it to the board, he could. I'd have paid Friday. Which Friday? She asked. At the Price's cottage, neighbours left flowers. Mrs. Price received them steadily and took Miss Marple to a kitchen arranged like a hymn. A clean oval on a shelf showed where a small tin had sat. Dust around it was freshly disturbed. Near the oil can rested a tiny pot, neatly stoppered, its rim crusted amber. I asked Leonard to mend the wicket latch, she said. He would not. I did it myself after he left. A dab of resin settles obstinacies. Back at her gate she rehearsed the hour. A man pleased with an envelope. A glass placed where hands would shift it. Essence lending plausibility. A mallet sticky, so a young man would advertise having touched it. A wicket latch dabbed by a careful wife. A hedge that caught lace. A compact, a nudge. The word nearly. The look, half relief before sorrow remembered itself. She wrote 2 notes. One to Hale asking for 5 minutes with the ledger, and one to Mrs. Latham for a lemon posset recipe, a pretext that would carry her into kitchens without solemnity. Then she put on her plainest hat and walked to the Weatherbys with a jar of preserved gooseberries. The ledger came out as if it had been longing. Columns marched. Shillings, half-crowns, overdue promises, the raffle cake dispute, all in a firm hand. Dear Alice must be supervised, Mrs. Weatherby said. She flusters. One must supervise what one values, Miss Marple agreed, drifting to the scullery. The essence bottle stood rinsed and reversed. On the draining board, glasses dried necks down. A single tumbler bore a tiny nick, and on a folded tea towel lay a faint crescent stain, as if something had been pressed and lifted. Do you prefer essence to fruit? She asked. In bulk, yes, said Mrs. Weatherby, Fruit is capricious. Essence obeys except when shopkeepers do not. That bottle was not quite right. I said so. Alice entered with string and courage. I moved the glass once, miss, only once, she blurted. Too tidy the bench. It may matter beautifully, Miss Marple said. On the way out she paused by the wicket. Instead of studying the lace, she looked at the ground beneath. On a blade of grass clung a breadcrumb of amber, the size of a pinhead. She did not touch it. Inspector Hale met her at the gate. Templeton's compact is with me, he said. Bartlett is giving a statement. Dilly is offended at the notion of rat poison. The doctor says a dab on a rim survives longer than bitterness in a jug. Then leave the bench as it is, Miss Marple said, and arrest nobody today. You think the person needs rope. I think the person is best at doing right when watched and worst when no one thinks to look. He considered. What do you want? Only a quiet word with Mrs. Price about envelopes, she said, and the village's habit of tidying. That afternoon the village practiced grief by calling. Cakes and awkward sentences were set down. The croquet bench, preserved as found, acquired the hush of a relic. 2 boys were shooed. Mrs. Templeton warned a child not to smudge. Mrs. Weatherby, passing with a basket, paused and straightened a tea-cloth. Miss Marple, knitting but counting pulses instead of stitches, saw her hover by the bench, hand lifted toward the glass, then corrected to the cloth. Tom Bartlett, released with a caution and an ashen face, avoided the bench. Alice, recruited to pass plates, looked once at Miss Marple and then at nothing. When the sun tipped, Mrs. Price came out to thank the last callers. Her voice faltered on an unspoken name. Miss Marple rose and steadied the tray. "My dear," she said, "let me help you inside." As they crossed the threshold, she added softly, "When Leonard was pleased yesterday, did he speak of what he had remembered?" Mrs. Price glanced at the envelope on the mantel, addressed to her husband in his own careful hand and empty of comfort. He only said, "Now we shall see." Through the window the bench held its pose, the glass catching late light, the hedge lifting and settling. It would not be long before someone, acting for the public good, could not resist doing something correct. Miss Marple settled to wait for untidiness in a dutiful hand that afternoon. The bench remained untouched throughout the evening, its glass gleaming faintly as the last of the sunlight drained from the lawn. Miss Marple, sitting by her window with her knitting abandoned in her lap, had the quiet patience of one who knew that people rarely kept their intentions hidden for long. In Little Ashford, doing what was proper always came before doing what was wise, and sooner or later someone's desire to tidy, explain, or protect would betray them. When Inspector Hale called again after supper, he was brisk but uneasy. "I've kept the village under watch. Bartlett has been seen with his mother. Alice stays indoors. Her aunt rarely lets her out. Mrs. Templeton has produced a diary to prove she was with her cousin when she left the fete. Dilly is red in the face at the suggestion he mislaid poison. Mrs. Price remains calm, which unnerves me more than weeping would." Miss Marple offered him a seat and a plain biscuit. "Calm can be armor," she said, "though sometimes it is resignation. Tell me, Inspector, what of the glass? No one has touched it. I put a constable to stand by, and he swears no one has come near. But a constable's eye wanders if the widow sneezes or a child cries. I don't trust a glass to remain still when so many hands itch to neaten." "They always do," Miss Marple agreed, "but restraint can be more revealing than meddling. Did you notice Mrs. Weatherby today?" She hovered near the bench, hand half extended. "That instinct to correct may prove louder than words." Hale leaned back. "I had the impression she wished to move the glass, yes. Yet her ledger is impeccable. She is the sort to fuss but not to poison." Miss Marple's smile was faint. "Ah, but fussing is not the opposite of poison, Inspector. It is a companion to it. The fussy person cannot bear disorder, whether in a linen cupboard, a household, or a village reputation. If Mr. Price had discovered something best kept folded away, a fussy hand might very well have reached for a drastic solution." The inspector rubbed his chin. You are suggesting motive, not method. Both, Miss Marple said gently. Poison is tidy. It requires little force, little noise, little scene. It suits those who fear disruption above all things. Their conversation was interrupted by a knock at the door. Alice stood there, pale as milk, wringing her hands. Aunt sent me to bring back her scarf she left on the croquet bench, she whispered, eyes darting between them. The scarf? Hale repeated sharply. Alice nodded. She said it would be spoiled by the damp if I left it longer. She told me to fetch it before dark. Hale rose at once, but Miss Marple lifted a quieting hand. My dear, she said kindly to Alice, you've done right to come here first. The scarf will be safe enough until morning. Tell your aunt you could not find it, and go home. Let her ask for it herself if she wishes it so much. Alice looked relieved, curtsied in her clumsy way, and hurried off. Hale shut the door with a grim expression. You were correct. Someone means to touch that bench, and in doing so, they show us what they cannot bear to leave alone, Miss Marple murmured. The following morning brought a sharp wind that rattled windows and swept the village lanes clean of fallen petals. People, restless after the shock, went about with forced industry. The widow was visited by half the parish. Mrs. Weatherby announced a collection for funeral costs. Mrs. Templeton told 3 versions of her cousin's alibi, and Tom Bartlett carried himself with the stubborn gloom of a man determined to seem innocent, which is always suspicious in itself. Miss Marple, however, took a different path. She walked to the vicarage garden with her knitting basket, appearing as though she meant to gather fallen roses. Inspector Hale had already placed 2 constables there, but the bench and glass remained untouched. The lace fragment still clung to the hedge. Hale joined her quietly. Nothing has changed, he said, and yet everything feels altered. Because people have slept on it, Miss Marple answered. Sleep hardens resolve or phrase it. The one who put poison on that glass must now endure the sight of it, standing there for all to speculate upon. Few natures can bear such pressure without trying to ease it. As if to prove her point, Mrs. Weatherby soon appeared, basket in hand. She exclaimed at the untidiness of the lawn, at the dampness of the hedge, at the impropriety of leaving a fate's debris lying about for children to see. It sets a dreadful example, she said firmly. I shall clear it away myself if no one else will. Her hand, plump and steady, moved toward the glass. At once Hale stepped forward, his voice sharp. Leave that where it is, madam. Mrs. Weatherby froze, colour rushing to her cheeks. Inspector, really? One must tidy. This is the vicarage, not a common field. Think of the example. Think of the evidence, Hale said coldly. That glass will not be moved until I say so. For a heartbeat, Mrs. Weatherby looked directly at him, and in her eyes flickered something not quite fear, not quite guilt, but the deep indignation of a woman whose carefully managed world had been disrupted. She turned away, muttering about officiousness, and walked off at a brisk pace. Miss Marple's needles clicked softly. There you see it, Inspector. Relief makes people careless. She wanted to dispose of the glass because it represented disorder, because it was a reminder of what she already knows. But does that make her a poisoner? Hale pressed. Not alone, Miss Marple said, but it makes her capable of protecting one. That afternoon, Miss Marple paid a call on Mrs. Price. The widow received her with quiet dignity, though her hands worked restlessly with a dishcloth as they spoke. They say Leonard argued with Tom Bartlett, she said. They say many things. He was not easy, but he was honest. Honesty often cuts deeper than falsehood, Miss Marple observed. Tell me, did Leonard ever confide in you about what he carried in that envelope? Mrs. Price shook her head. He liked to manage his own affairs. I knew better than to ask. He always said he would protect me by keeping me ignorant. Miss Marple sighed. Protection is a word used as often for pride as for kindness. As she left, she noted a faint scent lingering in the kitchen, resin, sharp and acrid. She glanced at the shelf where the widow had shown her the stoppered pot the day before. It was gone. Only a pale ring in the dust remained. When she mentioned this to Hale later, his expression darkened. Resin on the mallet, resin on the latch, and now resin missing from the widow's shelf. If she used it, she had reason. But for what? To fix, to fasten, or to mask? Masking is clever, Miss Marple said, and cleverness in Little Ashford is always suspicious, because it so seldom shows itself, except in emergencies. That evening, as twilight deepened, the bench at the vicarage drew attention once more. A small group of villagers lingered after prayers, whispering as they looked at it. Alice stood among them, clutching her shawl, her lips moving as if silently counting. Tom Bartlett, passing by, stopped to glare at the glass as though it were a personal accuser. Mrs. Templeton fluttered about, warning children to keep clear. And Mrs. Weatherby, unflinching, stood tall and announced that if the inspector would not act, she would insist the vicar himself demand the removal of such an unsightly relic. The constable on duty kept his hand near the glass as though guarding treasure. Miss Marple, watching from the shadow of a yew, thought to herself that the murderer was already trapped, not by police vigilance, but by the very thing they most feared, their own need to make disorder vanish. The village could chatter as it pleased, but the truth was already creeping into the open. One tidying impulse at a time, she turned homeward, her knitting once again tucked under her arm, knowing the night would bring restlessness to more than one household. Somewhere behind one of those lamp-lit windows, a guilty hand itched to put things in order, and when it moved, she would be ready. Night pressed heavily on Little Ashford, the kind of night when shutters closed early and lamps burned longer than usual, as though brightness could ward off unease. Miss Marple sat by her fire, her knitting untouched. She was not waiting in idleness, but listening, for footsteps that crossed too quickly, for knocks withheld, for the odd hush that falls on a lane when someone moves with guilty purpose. Her teapot cooled beside her untouched, when at last she heard it, the faint scrape of shoes on gravel near her gate. She did not stir. The sound passed, paused, returned, then faded toward the vicarage garden. In the morning Inspector Hale arrived, face lined from little sleep. "The glass has been overturned," he announced grimly. Constable swears he left it untouched until midnight, then went to see to a lantern. When he returned, it lay on the ground, cracked. "No one admits to passing." "Admits," Miss Marple repeated softly. "Confession and truth are seldom twins." "Who was seen nearby?" "Mrs. Weatherby said she went out to settle hens." "Tom Bartlett says he walked to the pump for water." "Mrs. Templeton claims she forgot her prayer book at the vicarage." "All between 11:30 and midnight," Hale exhaled. "Too many midnight errands for such a small place, and yet entirely expected," Miss Marple said. A visible reminder of disorder drew them all like moths. Some were curious, some fearful, one very possibly the hand that tipped it. They went together to the vicarage. The bench still bore its pale ring, but the glass lay in shards nearby. Hale had ordered them left in place. Miss Marple bent carefully, noting a smear of resin across one shard. She pointed it out with her knitting needle. "Resin again," Hale muttered. "Always resin. And resin, you know, is a mender," she said. "But menders sometimes overmend. Tell me, Inspector, do you know what Mr. Price had in that missing envelope?" "Not yet. The widow swears she never saw its contents. Bartlett insists he paid nothing. Daly claims he gave his due long before. Weatherby says her household settled accounts in full. Templeton says she overpaid. All correct. None revealing." "Then perhaps it was not money," Miss Marple murmured. "An envelope can hold more dangerous things than coins. A list, perhaps, or a letter, something that pricked where pride was tender." As they spoke, Alice hurried across the lawn, eyes wide with fear. She clutched a folded paper. "Please, Miss Marple, I found this in the scullery drawer this morning. Aunt hid it, but I saw. I think it was Mr. Price's." She thrust the paper into Miss Marple's hand before Hale could stop her. It was indeed an envelope, empty but for a faint smear along the flap. Miss Marple lifted it to her nose. "Resin," she said. "A dab used to reseal. Someone tampered, not merely stole." Hale's jaw tightened. This Weatherby girl risks too much. She risks truth, Miss Marple corrected. But truth is often borne by the timid. She folded the envelope carefully and handed it back to Hale. It proves what I suspected. Mr. Price had something. Showed his satisfaction too plainly, and another hand ensured it vanished. That evening, a village meeting was called at the vicarage hall. The vicar, pale and trembling, insisted it was only to pray for the deceased and support his widow. But everyone knew it was more. The benches filled. Whispers flew. Eyes darted toward Mrs. Weatherby, who sat stiff and indignant, toward Tom Bartlett, whose shoulders slumped, and toward Mrs. Templeton, who dabbed theatrically at her eyes. Miss Marple chose a place near the back, knitting slowly. Hale stood discreetly at the side, observing. The vicar's prayers were earnest but brief. Then silence fell, thick with unspoken accusations. It was Mrs. Weatherby who broke it. "This cannot go on," she declared, rising. "Our village's name is dragged in the mud, and for what? A glass, a hedge, a bit of lace? It is improper. It is cruel to the widow. I say we put the matter behind us and speak of it no more." Her words sparked a murmur, half relief, half protest. Tom Bartlett leapt up, face burning. "Easy for you to say, Mrs. Weatherby, when folk point at me. I never touched that glass. You've told half the parish otherwise." "Your name was in arrears," she snapped. "Leonard said so himself. And if it was, that's no cause for murder." The room buzzed. Miss Marple let her needles click a moment longer, then set them aside. "Perhaps," she said in her gentle voice, which carried more firmly than any shout, "it would be wiser to ask not who owed money, but who owed silence." The villagers turned, startled by her interruption. She looked serenely back at them, spectacles glinting. Mr. Price had a habit of remembering things. He was pleased on Fête Day because he had remembered something useful, something written down. That something is now missing. It was not debt, it was knowledge. And knowledge, I fear, is more dangerous than coins. Hale watched her expression unreadable. The villagers shifted uneasily. Mrs. Templeton muttered about scandal. Mrs. Weatherby pursed her lips. Tom Bartlett sat heavily, as though relieved someone else had taken the burden from his shoulders. When the meeting dissolved, Hale escorted Miss Marple out. "You throw pebbles and ripples spread," he said quietly. "Was it wise?" "Ripples flush things from reeds, Inspector. You must watch who stirs most uneasily in the days to come." And indeed the next day brought stirrings. Mrs. Weatherby was seen burning papers in her grate. Mrs. Templeton sent her maid to the post in great haste. Tom Bartlett kept away from the pump altogether. But it was the widow who drew Miss Marple's attention. Mrs. Price walked each morning with calm dignity, but when she thought herself unobserved, she pressed her hands together as though steadying tremors. Miss Marple called upon her with a small jar of jam. The widow received her politely, and they spoke of trifles until Miss Marple said gently, "Your husband believed he protected you by silence. But silence is sometimes a heavier burden than truth." Mrs. Price's eyes filled suddenly. "You think I know something, but I do not. Only I saw Leonard write a name on a scrap of paper. He folded it into the envelope. When I asked, he said it was no concern of mine. But the name, oh, I read it despite myself. It was Alice." Miss Marple held her gaze, but her voice remained calm. "Then your husband's pleasure came from having proof of some fault he could expose. That is why the envelope was stolen. But do not fear, my dear. Alice is more a pawn than a player." As she left, Miss Marple's thoughts ran swiftly. A name written, an envelope resealed, resin everywhere, and the girl's nervous counting. Alice had stumbled near truth, and someone had decided Mr. Price's memory must never become public knowledge. But whether the motive was to shield Alice, or to protect another through her, that still waited to be seen. That evening the wind rose again, rattling shutters and scattering petals from the roses that had so brightened the fete. Miss Marple, seated by her fire, resumed her knitting at last, though her needles kept time with her thoughts. The murderer was close. hemmed in by their own compulsion to tidy, to silence, to erase. All that remained was to let them try once more, and when they did, to be waiting with the quiet certainty of one who had seen the same weakness play out in a dozen villages before. Morning brought a brittle brightness, the kind that throws every edge into relief and leaves shadows looking guilty. Miss Marple, who believed that light is most useful when invited rather than chased, sent 3 notes by a small boy with good legs and a bad memory. By noon she had gathered what she wanted at the vicarage kitchen under the pretext of a housekeeping bee. The vicar's wife, grateful, had lent her the domain. Hale, forewarned, kept himself politely in the next room with a window on the yard. Mrs. Weatherby arrived first, complaining of mismanaged mops. Mrs. Templeton fluttered in late with apologies and perfume. Tom Bartlett lugged a bucket with the air of a man carrying a confession. Alice followed, eyes large, and last of all came Mrs. Price, composed and pale, with a folded apron over her arm. The kitchen smelled of soap and damp wood. Miss Marple set tasks with an artless efficiency that placed hands where she wished them to be. Mrs. Weatherby was given the dresser drawers to straighten, Mrs. Templeton to polish the brass, Tom to scrub the flagstones by the back door, Alice to dry, Mrs. Price to fold clean cloths and set them on the shelf. "We shall make a virtue of necessity," Miss Marple said, laying a neat row of cups upon a towel. "And when one works, one drinks. Alice, you will pour when I call." The girl nodded, counting the cups silently, as though they might vanish between numbers. Near the sink, a small brown bottle stood among vinegar and blue. "Essence?" Mrs. Weatherby sniffed. It had better be from a respectable shop. She reached for it, then thought better and snatched her hand away as if she had been pricked. Miss Marple's gaze did not follow the hand. She watched instead the flick of Mrs. Price's eyes toward the bottle and back again, a movement so slight that it would have vanished in any room less tidy than this. They worked. Work like prayer tames speech. Even Mrs. Templeton's commentary dwindled to sighs. Tom scrubbed dutifully, jaw clenched, lips set as if refusing an argument that had not yet been offered. Mrs. Weatherby folded paper liners as if they would march to their places without her if allowed. Mrs. Price's hands moved economically over the cloths, pairing napkin with napkin, aligning edges as if each habit obeyed a law she did not dare question. Miss Marple, unhurried, filled the kettle, set it to sing, and placed a small, unremarkable envelope near the sugar basin, where a housewife's eye would tidy it away without asking why it lay where it did. Steam rose. The kettle whistled. "Alice," Miss Marple called, "the tea." Alice reached for the cups, paused to count again, then fetched the pot. She had poured 2 when Miss Marple lifted a palm. "Wait a moment, dear. Fresh water in that one. I've not warmed it." She turned the cup aside, caught the faintest whiff of something not tea, flat, defensive, as if lemon dared her to dislike it. Her thumb, invisible to the room, touched the rim and came away faintly tacky. Resin again, only the smallest smear, the sort that would pass as a housewifely repair on a cracked cup. "Inspector," Miss Marple called conversationally, though she did not turn her head. Hale entered at once. She gave him the cup and one brief look. He nodded, carried it out, and returned within half a minute, as if he had forgotten his hat. No one asked questions. Their silence was a different kind of noise. Mrs. Templeton had gone white about the lips. Tom scrubbed a shade harder. Mrs. Weatherby briskly displaced the essence bottle to the farther end of the shelf, with 2 small, offended pushes. Mrs. Price folded a towel twice, then twice again, the movement becoming absurdly precise, and at last set it down as if it might dissolve. "Such a fuss for tea," Mrs. Weatherby said too loudly. "Anyone would think we were under suspicion simply for living." Miss Marple murmured agreement and moved the small envelope a finger's breadth closer to the edge of the table, where a tidy soul would rescue it from falling. She did not look at it again. She looked instead at Hans. Who had flourishes, who had economy, who curled fingers inward after every task as if unwilling to leave prints upon the world. Alice, drying, touched each cup rim as though afraid they might cut her. Tom's knuckles were rawned. Mrs. Templeton's nails were immaculate. Mrs. Weatherby's palms bore the glossy polish of perpetual hot water. Mrs. Price's hands were bare, small, deceptively still. The kettle sang again, absurd and domestic, and Miss Marple said, "Now then, dear," to Alice, and in that very simple moment the room rearranged itself. Mrs. Price took one step, only one, toward the table, toward the envelope, toward the small drift of disorder. It would have been nothing to any other eye. To Miss Marple it was a step that began before the mind gave it permission, the step of a woman who could endure grief, but not a crooked line. The envelope trembled at the table's edge. Mrs. Price's fingers, those orderly fingers, lifted it with a swift, efficient motion and in the same breath, so deftly that Mrs. Templeton uttered a small cry of admiration, slid it beneath the folded cloths. Hale's voice came from the doorway, gentle as a hand on a shoulder. "Leave it where it is, madam." Mrs. Price froze. The envelope lay half-shrouded by napkins, indecisive between concealment and propriety. She looked up, not at Hale, but at Miss Marple, as if asking whether there was some older law that excused her. "I did not know it mattered," she said. "It is only untidy." "Only untidy," Miss Marple repeated, and her tone made the words bear more weight than their size allowed. "Alice, dear, finish pouring. For yourself, take the end cup. For Mrs. Weatherby, the next. For Mrs. Price, no, not that one. Give her this." Her small hand slid a plain, clean cup forward, as tenderly as if she were putting a child to bed. They drank. Tea restores courage, which is not always to the good. Mrs. Templeton recovered first. "I cannot bear this," she declared. "We are played with like chessmen. If there is something to say, say it. If you have evidence, produce it. I, for one, refuse to be frightened by envelopes and housekeeping." She looked bravely toward the window, where Hale's constable strolled as if looking for lost daisies. Miss Marple's reply was very mild. "There is a thing I should like cleared up. On Fête Day, someone resealed a certain envelope with resin. Someone dabbed resin on a mallet handle and on a latch, clumsy little dabs in all the places a hand might go. Someone last night smeared a rim that would come to Alice's lips. This morning someone nudged an envelope nearer the cloths where it might be put away, perhaps thrown out as rubbish later, without scandal. It is all very small work, but to small minds small work is a refuge." Tom's voice broke in, hoarse. "Who wants to harm Alice? What's she done? She hasn't got it in her to hurt a fly." "Precisely," Miss Marple said. "It is not Alice's deeds that matter. It is what she saw and more, what her name can be made to carry." She turned her eyes upon Mrs. Weatherby, whose indignation had hardened into a stubborn gloss. Mrs. Weatherby would tidy anything, even a crime, if it meant the villager's skirt stayed clean. But she blusters after the act, and Mrs. Templeton flutters too loudly to move so quietly in the dark. "What then do you mean to say?" Hale asked, not to hurry her but to give the room a path. "Only this," Miss Marple said, and now her voice had no frill at all. "A woman who has lived long under correction learns to correct the world herself. She straightens what is crooked, puts away what shows, seals what ought not to open, and when a man threatens to pin up people's names, she thinks first of the line of the board, and only afterward of the neck beneath the pin. She may love none of it. She merely cannot help herself." There was a small sound then, not a sob, not a denial, but the faintest release of breath. Mrs. Price's hands lay open upon the folded cloths, empty, resigned, as though they had at last put down a weight they had carried too carefully. "He was so pleased," she said without looking up. "He always was, when he remembered a thing that would make others behave. He said he had written Alice's name to stop tongues. He would show that she had taken nothing, that someone else had put the money in her purse to shame her into a lesson. He would post the list today, and then we should all be improved." Alice made a strangled sound. Tom swore softly, as if prayer and oath had met in him and found no room. Leonard was a great improver, Mrs. Price went on, almost conversationally. He improved me for 20 years. I did not see why Alice must be improved by humiliation. I thought there were other ways. A little resin, a little lemon. It would be very quiet, no boards, no pointing. Only stillness. She took a breath as if surfacing. But I had not thought about the glass. Her eyes went at last to Miss Marple's, searching for an absolution the law does not carry. Afterward there was so much to put straight. Silence held. The kettle sang itself out. Hale did not move for a long second. When he did, it was to take the envelope gently from beneath the cloths. He did not touch Mrs. Price's hands. Miss Marple, who had prepared herself to dislike what must come next, felt instead the old sorrowful tenderness for people who commit their crimes with housekeeping tools. Outside the wind dropped. Inside cups cooled. A small draught lifted the lace at the window and let it fall again, as if the village itself had exhaled. Hale did not speak at once. The kitchen settled. 5 people remembered how to breathe. At last he said, "Mrs. Price, I must ask you to come with me." He did not touch her. She rose with the obedience of one long practiced in leaving rooms when bidden. Alice made to follow, then stopped. Tom stared at the floor as if numbers might form there to tell him what to do. Miss Marple moved first, not to intercede, but to lay a shawl over the widow's arm. "You will want this," she said. Mrs. Price gave a nod and went out between Hale and the constable, the way narrowing not by force but by duty. Mrs. Weatherby found her voice when the latch clicked. "Monstrous," she declared. "A woman in grief led away like a thief. Inspector, have you no proportion?" "No one is dragged," Hale said. "She has spoken for herself." "For the village's sake, say no more of it," Mrs. Weatherby insisted. "We must draw a line." "Lines are useful," Miss Marple answered. "They show where crossing has already begun." After they had gone, the kitchen sagged back into itself. Mrs. Templeton dabbed at her eyes, then adjusted her hat in the kettle's reflection. Tom set the bucket aside and sat on it like a man accepting a punishment that did not fit the offense. "It isn't right," he muttered. "She did it for kindness." "Kindness and murder have shared a hallway," Miss Marple said. "The pity only means we must walk more carefully." Alice lifted her head. "Miss," she whispered, "if Mr. Price meant to save me, who meant to hurt me?" "That," said Miss Marple, "is the piece still crooked." She sent them away with small tasks, then went to the station. Hale had set Mrs. Price in a room and ordered tea that asked no questions. "You think me hard," he said. "I think you proper," she replied. "You have the murder." "We have not yet the mischief that bred it," he gestured. "Say it. Someone else, not the widow. Tampered with the envelope before the fete, resealed it with resin, and later tried to silence a nervous girl who had seen more than she knew." "Mrs. Weatherby," he said at once, and winced. "She is tidy," Miss Marple agreed, "but tidy natures arrange witnesses." She stamped and scolded in daylight. "I am not satisfied. Mrs. Templeton, conscience in silk." She moved the glass. "But she loves an audience. Our meddler practiced in sculleries and at midnight. Dilly? He keeps his till. Resin is not his style. It is simple," she said, "like knitting. One must not drop what was cast on." She asked to see Mrs. Price again. The widow sat with folded hands, calm as a winter pond. "My dear," Miss Marple said, "when your husband meant to pin up a list, who else heard of it?" "He told no one," she said. "But he liked to hint. He told Mrs. Weatherby that accounts would be settled in public, Tom that Friday would be his day of shame, and Mrs. Templeton that gossip would be silenced." "And the envelope?" "He wrote Alice the night before, folded a slip from the ledger, I think. In the morning it was gone. After the fete I found the envelope on the kitchen shelf, empty and tacky where I keep the resin. The back door? On the latch for the milk," she murmured. When Miss Marple came out, she said, "If the envelope lay on that shelf before the fete, and resin beside it, the thief was comfortable there. Not a prowler, a helper. Someone who walks in and out of neighbours' kitchens without remark. Mrs. Weatherby, Hale said again, softer. She is the parish's appetite for order, Miss Marple said. But I want one more spoonful of proof. They went to the Weatherbys. The grate was swept, but ashes tell tales. Hale sifted with the poker and drew out a curled scrap with a half number and a loop of a letter. Mrs. Weatherby, affronted, said she had burned only old receipts. She hugged her ledger as if it were a certificate. Inspector, she said, this is indecent. Indecency, Miss Marple answered softly, is being caught after one has rehearsed innocence. If that envelope turned up at Mrs. Price's, Mrs. Weatherby retorted, that is her housekeeping, not mine. Just so, Miss Marple said. And yet resin wandered from her shelf to the mallet and to your tea towel. My towel? In the vicarage, Miss Marple said. A crescent of amber pressed and lifted. Mrs. Weatherby's composure trembled. You think Why would I harm that girl? I have given her work. You have used her, Miss Marple said. Whoever tucked coins into her purse meant a little lesson if Mr. Price's list went up. But the village would have seen cruelty. You saw it sooner than he. You rearranged the scene. Mrs. Weatherby's hands opened and closed. I only wished to spare us a spectacle. By lifting the slip from the envelope so proof could not be compared with the ledger. By returning the husk, sealed, so a husband might blame a wife's muddle. By tipping the glass in the night. And by smearing later a rim that would come to Alice's lips. Miss Marple's voice softened. You did not pour the first poison. You tidied after it. I have kept this place proper for 20 years, Mrs. Weatherby said at last. Leonard liked public remedies. I prefer private ones. And yet, Miss Marple said, we are not the same now. You will say I made it worse. I will say you mistook concealment for repair. They left her with her ledger. Outside, Hale drew breath. 2 women, he said. One killed from exhaustion with being improved. One meddled from exhaustion with seeing others improved. Between them a girl. And at the center a man pleased with his usefulness, Miss Marple said. They walked as far as the wicket gate. The clean swipe across the dusty latch was fainter now. Nothing stays new for long, she said. Not even guilt. What remains? Hale asked. Alice, she said. She must be told that the name in the envelope was to clear, not accuse. And the parish must be told the same. That will not be easy, he said. You are the law, she answered. I will be there to hear what the law misses. That evening the church was half full. The vicar spoke briefly. Hale explained what could be explained, and promised no more than should be promised. He did not name Mrs. Weatherby. He did not need to. He named Mrs. Price because he must. There was a sound, not outrage, not approval, but the shifting that accepts something must be done. Alice sat straight, counting nothing. Tom's hand closed over hers. Miss Marple watched faces alter, resentments dimming, curiosities slackening. When it was over, people went home slowly, like children after a lesson they half grasp and wholly dislike. On the step, Hale said, You will sleep. After I put my kitchen in order, she said. But I shall not tidy away what I have learned tonight. Inspector Hale stepped out of the lane by the smithy, hat in hand. Magistrate tomorrow, he said. I shall do as I must. You will do it kindly, she answered. Kindness belongs to the law as much as iron. But before tomorrow there is today, and today wants one more small truth tidied, properly this time. Another of your edges, he said. Which? The hand that put coins in Alice's purse. Leonard Price thought to expose it. Mrs. Price burned the exposure. Mrs. Weatherby brushed crumbs from the table of scandal. But who baked the loaf? Hale's mouth tightened. The parish will prefer that to go unnamed. Parishes prefer many things, Miss Marple said. They are seldom consulted by the truth. They walked toward the green. Their notice had gone up on the board. Service of prayer for mercy and guidance, 7 o'clock. Beneath it someone had pinned a lost-and-found card in a neat, girlish hand, Alice's, listing a compact, a glove, and a small purse of coins. That last item had been written, then crossed out carefully. as if the writer feared even the suggestion might summon trouble. Mrs. Templeton appeared in a flutter of scent. "My compact, certainly," she said to Alice, who stood by the board. "I should never forgive myself if a servant were punished for an honest mislaying." She smiled sideways at Tom. He looked away. Miss Marple said, "You are fortunate, Mrs. Templeton. The vicar's wife keeps found things in the vestry press." Mrs. Templeton's lashes lowered. "I shall fetch it at once." "Do," Miss Marple said pleasantly. "But leave the maid. She will be useful when we compare lists." It was the tone that halted the lady. "Compare? Between the fate ledger and the lost table," Miss Marple said. "There is a sweetness in balances. Mr. Price believed in it robustly. I prefer a kitchen scale." Inside the vestry, the vicar's wife brought out a box, a button, a ribbon, the compact, a handkerchief marked E.T., and a cheap purse with a broken catch. Alice, pale but intent, counted under her breath. Mrs. Templeton recovered her compact with gratitude, excessive to the object. "Before you go," Miss Marple said, "a small explanation. You were at the croquet bench before the scream. You moved the glass. You send your maid quickly when you intend to forget." The lashes rose. "Is a lady to be judged for charity?" "She is judged for practice," Miss Marple said. Hale considered the purse. "Who found it?" Alice faltered. "It was in the press this morning. Mr. Price used to say, 'Look to your purse, child,' so I looked." Miss Marple opened the purse with a neat thumb. Inside lay 3 coppers and a folded paper, softened by time. A list for roses, 3 to Mrs. Templeton, 2 to the vicar's wife, 1 to Alice's aunt. And beneath, in a different hand, forgotten debt. "See me after." Mr. Price's underline had the cheerful malice of an improver. "Why keep this?" Hale asked. "To remind," Miss Marple said. "And notice the fold quarters," as a maid folds a note slipped into a pocket and told, "Take this to your lady." Mrs. Templeton coloured. "I never—" "Not poison," Miss Marple said gently. "You prefer an audience. But you have economy. You do not like paying twice for gossip spread once. You arranged for coins to be found upon Alice, an old trick. Mr. Price saw through it. He meant to pin up not her name but yours beside hers, the hand that plants and the hand that is planted." Mrs. Templeton's gloved fingers tightened. "He would not have dared." "He dared improve people for sport," Miss Marple said. "You could have borne a private scolding. You could not bear a public one." "I would have spoken to Mrs. Weatherby," Mrs. Templeton flashed. "She knows how to smooth." "She smoothed," Miss Marple said. "Smoothing nearly suffocated a girl," Hale said. "Proof?" "Remembrances," Miss Marple replied. "Your maid told the haberdasher she needed a buckle for my lady's old party purse," described the catch. "The haberdasher is a cousin." "Add your brave journey to the vestry too late last night. Prayer book indeed. You came to see whether the purse slept where you had laid it." Mrs. Templeton laughed, brittle as the catch. "You will not drag me to a cell over a buckle." "The law will not," Hale said, "but the vestry may refuse your errands." "That will bite deeper." Colour rose, then faded. "The village will talk," she whispered. "It always does," Miss Marple said. "Let it remember that Alice did not steal, that Tom owes only by the week, that Mrs. Weatherby's zeal outran judgment, and that a widow is to be pitied and punished in the same breath." They stepped out. The bell would ring at 7. People were already inventing forgivenesses they might call principles if asked. Miss Marple watched Alice's shoulders lower the inch that says a weight has been set down. Tom stood near without swagger. Hale said, "You have your small truth." "Small and central," she said. "Poison sticks to the fingers that pour it. Malice clings to those who pass it along in parcels." They walked to the wicket gate. The smear on the latch had almost worn away. "Resin goes," Miss Marple said. "So do sharpnesses of grief. The thing that remains is habit." Mrs. Price smoothed. Leonard displayed. Mrs. Weatherby supervised. Mrs. Templeton contrived prettily. Habits, when crossed, supply motives enough. Where do you put yourself? Hale asked. In the drawer with the string, she said. Old useful, never strong enough to bind wickedness, only to tie up facts so they do not fall off the shelf. He smiled. You think we have reached the shelf? I think we may dust it, she said. And take care not to break the keepsakes. Evening fell more gently than before. In church the service was as advertised. Mercy asked, guidance accepted as far as comfort allowed. When they came out, the board showed no new notices. Alice's list had been replaced by one in the vicar's hand, thanking donors, and noting that the fate's proceeds would, in due course, mend a roof. The word due had been underlined twice, which made the parish smile. Miss Marple walked home under a sky that had chosen for the moment to be harmless. She paused by the hedge where the lace had told its small tale and snipped the tired flutter free. She did not keep it. She let it drift into her pocket and be forgotten there, as some things ought to be when lesson and pain have done their work. Tomorrow would belong to court and statements. Tonight belonged to cups washed, a teapot dried without attention, and a chair drawn nearer to the small fire that had watched milder villages make and unmake themselves. Quietly again tonight, morning kept its promise, yet the village woke as if something listened at every window. Miss Marple drank her tea, pinched a dead bloom and set out for the station before the magistrate sat. The sky was unbleached linen. A mild wind worried the hedge that once caught its lace. Inspector Hale met her outside the post office, where letters went in decisively. He touched his brim. She will make no scene, he said. Her solicitor advises plain truth, and Mrs. Weatherby. Their stern caution, he replied. She accepts it like a medal. Mrs. Templeton will apologize to Alice in public. Public apologies tame gossip for 2 days, Miss Marple said. On the third it needs biscuit. They watched Tom Bartlett cross to the smithy. Alice walked beside Mrs. Latham, whose errand stood between her and pity. The village had chosen its way forward, practiced, not tender. It would lower its voices, set plates on tables, and make room for the law without making room for grief. At the station the waiting room smelled of damp coats and ink. Mrs. Price stood when they entered. She had dressed as one does for church in bad weather. The shawl Miss Marple had given her lay across her arm. She looked at Miss Marple and then past her, the way people do when comfort speaks but cannot sign its promises. I do not repent, she said. I am sorry for the manner. I could have left him. I tell myself that at night, and it is sour bread. Miss Marple said only, You loved small quiets. It is a pity he made even those loud. Hale cleared his throat. We must go. They walked to the magistrate's room, where official language waited like furniture. The hearing was short. Mrs. Price spoke clearly. The doctor gave his facts. Hale gave his. It ended with remand and a date. Mrs. Weatherby was not present. She had gone to polish brass at the church. Outside the light had softened. The vicar paused by Miss Marple, with the look of a man who has mislaid a prayer he meant to use. Do we forgive? He asked. We remember, Miss Marple said. We are not obliged to bless what hurt and call it tidy. He nodded. Mrs. Templeton, pale and composed, approached Alice and made her apology in the middle of the street, each word unadorned. People stopped. Alice curtsied. Miss Marple saw her lift her head a fraction as she rose, and that was worth the spectacle. Tom, who had listened with fists in his pockets, took them out and carried one of Alice's parcels. Mrs. Latham, passing with soup, said, Well, then, in a tone that can usher a century out of a room, the vicarage lawn, stripped of bunting, kept a pale square where chairs had stood. The croquet set was back in its shed. The bench had been carried under a tree. Its ghostly ring would fade. Miss Marple paused where the glass had glittered, and thought of the tools people choose for malice and for virtue. Sometimes the same tools, sometimes the same hands. She was finished with the lawn. Hale joined her. You once told me people remain what they have been, he said. And it seems cruel when the past is small. "It can also be a rope thrown to a drowning person," she answered. "Mrs. Price will find a little order even there. She will fold her cell. She will keep a plant alive. And the village? It will be itself. It will say Mrs. Weatherby meant well. It will claim Mrs. Templeton meant no harm. It will praise you for restraint, and send posies to the prison and forget to water them. It will mend the roof which will creak in winter. Children will shout at the wicket gate and be shushed. That is the grace of villages. They wear their tragedies like a cardigan, put on, warmed in and folded. And you, Miss Marple, do you rest?" "I mend," she said. She mended by calling on Mrs. Weatherby with a basket of scones and an inquiry after Alice's hours. The house smelt of carbolic and apology. Mrs. Weatherby received her with stiff courtesy that softened when Miss Marple spoke of common tasks. They spoke of the funeral tea, and how many teaspoons a parish mislays in a decade. At the gate, Mrs. Weatherby said with tired honesty, "I meant to save us shame. It was always ugly," Miss Marple said. "You only wore yourself out making it neat." From there she went to Alice's lodging, where Mrs. Latham had set the girl folding bandages. Alice looked up and said, "Miss, is it all over?" "Only the shouting," Miss Marple said. "The rest takes longer." "I thought if I counted enough it would fit," Alice murmured. "But some things won't go to 10. "No," Miss Marple agreed. "Some things go to 1. You, for instance." She touched the girl's hand very lightly as quiet reassurance. "Keep to it." At supper-time, Miss Marple returned to her cottage, where the kettle knew its duty and the clock tolerated its ticking. She set a slice of bread before the fire and smiled at the char it attempted. On the table lay the small piece of lace. She put it into a drawer with old buttons and a stamp that had seen war. Twilight settled by the time Hale knocked. He came not as an inspector, but as a man who had spent his day with forms and faces that echo. She poured and sat, and he looked into the small fire as if it were a ledger finely balanced. "I have the oddest sense," he said, "that nothing was solved and yet nothing is loose." "That is how it should be," Miss Marple replied. "The tightness belongs to the guilty and to the law. The rest of us get only enough to sew on a button. And to string," she added. They drank. A child called in the lane, then laughed. Hale set down his cup. "If ever I am tempted to hurry, remind me of the bench," he said. "I nearly had Tom." "You had him enough," Miss Marple said. "You let him prove his decency by carrying a parcel instead of a charge." They shared a look of quiet conspiracy. When he rose to go, she saw him to the door. The night had put on stars. She stood a moment and thought of a garden party, a scream, a croquet mallet tacky with the wrongness of careful hands, and a woman who had decided at last that improvement was a word for other people's comfort. In the drawer the lace lay still. On the green the notice about the roof lifted and settled in the breeze. In Little Ashford, which is not better than any place and not worse, the bees woke early to their work and the humans a little after, taking up what they could carry and putting down what they must. Miss Marple slept well. She had left only what belonged to time, and that is as close to justice as one village or one woman ever gets. The funeral passed as such things do in English villages, with solemn hymns and whispered inventories of hats. Mrs. Price, escorted by Hale, walked with dignity, her composure more a shield than a comfort. Mrs. Weatherby arranged flowers with firm practicality, as if tidying the very earth. Mrs. Templeton dabbed discreetly, her sorrow a performance rehearsed, but not entirely false. Alice stood at the back with Tom beside her, his hand a steady weight on hers, their youth reminding all that life, however bruised, insists on continuing. Afterwards, tea was poured in the vicarage hall, subdued but necessary. Villagers murmured condolences, some genuine, some protective, each person weaving the tragedy into the fabric of gossip and memory. Miss Marple, quiet in her corner, watched faces more than words. She saw guilt ease its grip, pride soften, and compassion stir where self-preservation had so long taken root. It was Hale who finally joined her, standing with the air of a man both weary and resolved. We've done all that can be done, he said. Miss Marple looked at him with a faint, knowing smile. All, Inspector? No, we've done what must be done. What remains is for people to live with what they are, and that is a harder sentence than any court can pass. He considered this, and then unexpectedly laughed, though softly. You put things plain, Miss Marple. I envy that. It is not plainness, Inspector, she corrected gently. It is pattern. Human nature seldom changes its threads. It only rearranges them in the loom. See how Mrs. Weatherby folds her grief into duty, or how Mrs. Templeton wraps hers in silk. Even Tom Bartlett. He has chosen steadiness now because he saw where suspicion led. That is improvement enough. And Alice? Hale asked, his tone kinder. She will count less, Miss Marple said. But what she does count will be her own. That is a kind of freedom. They stood in silence as the gathering wound down, the vicar blessing people as they left. Outside, the churchyard settled into quiet once more, the flowers trembling slightly in the breeze, bees returning to their timeless business. As the last teacups were stacked away and the hall emptied, Miss Marple gathered her knitting bag and prepared to leave. At the doorway she paused, looking back for a moment, her eyes thoughtful. The tragedy had shaken the village, but it had also revealed it. Each person laid bare their secrets and motives like petals scattered after a storm. Some would be swept aside, some pressed into memory, but all were part of the whole. On her walk home she let the path lengthen under her steps. The cottages, the hedgerows, the sound of a distant child's laugh. It was all as it had been, and yet not. The village would never speak Leonard Price's name without a pause, nor mention Alice without recalling her narrow escape. Mrs. Price's absence would become another story, told in lowered voices over tea. And yet life would continue exactly as it always did. That was the way of such places. Continuity built not by denying tragedy, but by absorbing it until it became indistinguishable from history. At her gate, Miss Marple paused, looking at her roses, some wilting, some fresh. She bent to snip one bloom, not perfect but sufficient, and carried it inside. Setting it in a small glass by the window, she allowed herself a sigh. Justice, she knew, was seldom neat, seldom complete, but truth once revealed had its own quiet power. It was enough. Miss Marple sat by her fire, took up her knitting, and let her needles click steadily once more. Human nature, with all its frailties and small cruelties, would never change, and that, she reflected, was why there would always be mysteries and always, sadly, someone to solve them. And in Little Ashford, for now, there was peace.